And as it happens, the Treasurer Wayne Swan is our program guest this morning, joining us from Washington, where he's attending G20, IMF and World Bank meetings. But before them, we'll see what the Sunday papers are reporting around the country, and there does seem to be some coordination going on this morning, not only between Sydney, Melbourne newspapers, Dennis Atkins, but perhaps between the footy codes, the AFL and the NRL, who are taking on the Gillard government over poker machine reform.
Yes, they've all had the same idea all at once, and that is that they're against a mandatory pre-commitment legislation for poker machines. But I think the most interesting bit is Eddie Maguire, who's a bit of a big wheel in Melbourne, I think, in football circles.
Just before you go on, let's hear from Eddie. We have Eddie Maguire on the Today Show. Here he is.
To suddenly, out of nowhere, without any consultation, to have what looks like being a footy tax imposed is going to absolutely hit football clubs right between the eyes, and of course that'll extrapolate right through to all the football supporters and the members. So yeah, we're against it, absolutely against it.
OK, we've heard from Eddie Abbott.
Yeah.
Footy tax, a tax on all supporters.
Yes, yeah, it's a tax on everybody. A great big new tax, no doubt. I think Eddie Maguire's been watching the carbon tax debate, and he thinks, well, if you want to get stuck into something, call it a tax. That's what people hate.
Yeah, but it is another... Well, it's another ominous warning to the government that they're going to come up against all sorts of pressures, Gerard. I mean, you would know, being from New South Wales, that the clubs already have some powerful influence on the politicians.
And for good reason, because in New South Wales and in Queensland in particular, to a lesser extent in Victoria, I mean, these clubs are very often the areas where people on modest incomes and on pensions go for entertaining. The clubs do good work. Food is relatively cheap. There's a lot of entertainment. You can have a very good night there. A lot of the people who are going to these clubs don't have the money to go to inner-city flash restaurants. And so there's an appearance that the Labor government is hitting again at their heartland. And this is the real problem for Labor. And many of the Labor MPs in marginal seats in the suburbs and regional areas in New South Wales, Queensland, and I suspect in other states as well, are finding this very difficult to handle.
But are they actually suggesting that I mean, the clubs... the bigger clubs are they're not going to fold. There's no suggestion that they're going to fold. They're
not going to fold. I mean, one of the biggest clubs in Brisbane is the Kedron Wayville RSL, which is in Wayne Swan's electorate. And they've said in the last week or so, you know, that they're against mandatory pre-commitment, and they've said they'll have to scale back quite significantly their community involvement, and that's where it's not about the clubs folding, but it is about the clubs pulling out of supporting kids sport and other community events, and that's where the MPs are going to feel the heat.
But I wonder whether or not this is just their way of ramping up the pressure, so that they're throwing it out there, doing their scare tactics, but when it comes down to it, once the pre-commitment is introduced, those sort of things, you know, the roof won't fall in, the sky won't fall in.
Because we don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. But it's another issue where the Prime Minister did not go to the election with this promise. I mean, this came out, as we know, because of Andrew Wilkie, and so it's a difficult problem for Labor, and I don't know how it's going to be resolved, but if I was in a club, I'd be doing the same thing. I mean, that's what people do in democracies. They fight for their own position.
As one government backbencher said at one of those meetings, we're doing it because Wilkie wanted it, and that's the reality. But Andrew Wilkie, of course, is up for the fight, it seems.
Yes, he's being sued. He says he's being sued by Clubs Australia for calling them bullies over a stoush that they've been involved in over the Salvation Army being allowed to continue to operate, jingling the tin in their clubs in New South Wales. And Andrew Wilkie accused the Clubs Australia of bullying the Salvos, because the Salvos then backed off their strong support for the government's proposed legislation. So he's got Nick Xenophon as his legal advisor, and he's going to fight them, he says.